This story was sent to me by Sarah Martinez via email. I still wake up sometimes at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, checking the locks on my doors and windows. The sound of footsteps on gravel makes my blood run cold, even now, 2 years later. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. I was 24 at the time, working as a night shift nurse at a small hospital in rural Montana. The pay was decent and I needed the experience, but the drive home was always unsettling. 15 miles of winding mountain roads with nothing but trees and darkness on either side. I'd been doing it for about 6 months when things started getting weird. It began with little things. I'd noticed the same set of headlights behind me for longer than seemed normal. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, maybe another hospital worker heading home, or someone else with an odd schedule. The headlights would stay a consistent distance behind me, never getting closer, never falling back. When I'd turn into my driveway, they'd continue past my house and disappear around the bend. After about a week of this, I started paying more attention. The car was always there when I left work at midnight, and it would follow the same route I took home. Same distance, same speed. When I'd slow down, it would slow down. When I'd speed up slightly, it would match my pace perfectly. The headlights were positioned high, like a truck or SUV, and they had this slightly yellowish tint that made them stand out. One night, I decided to test my suspicions. Instead of taking my usual route home, I took a longer way that involved several unnecessary turns through a residential area. The headlights followed every turn. My heart started racing as I realized this wasn't coincidence anymore. Someone was deliberately following me. I drove to the local police station instead of going home. It was a small town, so the station was basically empty except for one officer on duty. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, and the headlights just stopped at the end of the block, waiting. Eventually, they disappeared, and I went inside to file a report. The officer was polite, but not particularly concerned. He said it could be someone who just happened to live in the same direction, and unless they actually approached me or my property, there wasn't much they could do. For the next few nights, I didn't see the headlights. I thought maybe involving the police had scared whoever it was away. I started to relax, thinking it was over. I was wrong. The following Tuesday night, the headlights were back, but this time they were closer, much closer. Instead of maintaining that respectful distance, they were riding right on my bumper, high beams blazing into my rearview mirror. I couldn't see anything but white light. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel as I tried to figure out what to do. I sped up, pushing my old Honda to 60 on roads that were meant for 40. The vehicle behind me matched my speed effortlessly. When I slowed down, hoping they'd pass me, they slowed down too. We were the only 2 cars on that dark mountain road, and I realized how completely vulnerable I was out there. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Up ahead, there was a section where the road curved sharply around a steep drop-off. No guardrail, just a few hundred feet down to rocks and trees. The headlights behind me suddenly got even brighter, and I felt a slight bump as the vehicle touched my rear bumper. They were trying to run me off the road.
I floored the accelerator, my car lurching forward as I took the curve faster than I'd ever driven before. My tires screamed against the asphalt, and for a terrifying moment, I felt the back end start to slide toward the edge. But I managed to maintain control and put some distance between myself and my pursuer. Instead of heading home, I drove straight to the nearest 24-hour gas station, about 10 miles away. It was one of those bright, fluorescently lit places that felt like a beacon of safety in the darkness. I pulled up right next to the front door, grabbed my phone, and ran inside. The clerk, a middle-aged man reading a magazine, looked up when I burst through the door, probably looking as panicked as I felt. I asked if I could stay inside for a while, that someone was following me. He let me call the police from the store phone, and we both watched through the windows for any sign of the vehicle that had been pursuing me. After about an hour, a police cruiser arrived. This time, it was a different officer, older, who seemed to take the situation more seriously. He followed me home, checking my property and making sure I got inside safely. He said they'd increase patrols in the area and gave me his direct number to call if it happened again. For 2 weeks, everything seemed normal. I thought maybe the police presence had solved the problem, but I was naive to think it would end that easily. The night it escalated was a particularly dark one. No moon, heavy cloud cover. I was about halfway home when I realized there were no other cars on the road at all, which was unusual even for that remote area. That's when I saw them in my rearview mirror, those same yellowish headlights. But now there were 2 sets of headlights. 2 vehicles were following me. My phone had no signal. It rarely did on that stretch of road, and I was still 8 miles from home. The vehicles behind me were maintaining that same calculated distance, but now I felt completely trapped. There was nowhere to go, no place to turn off, no help to call for. I started driving faster, pushing my car harder than I had ever done before. The speedometer hit 70, then 75. The vehicles behind me kept pace easily. And that's when I realized they probably were much more powerful than my little car. If they wanted to catch me, they could. Then something happened that I still can't fully explain. As I came around a bend, I saw flashing red and blue lights ahead, a police roadblock. 2 cruisers were positioned across the road with officers standing beside them. I'd never been so happy to see police lights in my life. I pulled up to the roadblock and one of the officers approached my window. He said they'd received reports of suspicious activity on this road and were doing random checks. Behind me, the 2 sets of headlights had vanished completely, just gone, as if they'd never been there. The officer escorted me home, and over the next few days, I learned more about what had been happening. Apparently, there had been several reports of vehicles following lone drivers on that stretch of road, mostly women leaving late shifts at various businesses. The police had set up periodic roadblocks and increased patrols, but they never caught whoever was responsible. I requested a transfer to day shift, even though it meant less pay. I couldn't handle those dark drives anymore, constantly checking my mirrors, jumping at every set of headlights. The strange thing is, I never found out who was following me or what they wanted. Sometimes not knowing is worse than knowing. Even now, when I'm driving at night, I still check my rearview mirror obsessively. I still feel that spike of fear when I see headlights that seem to be following the same route I am. Because somewhere out there, whoever was hunting lone drivers on dark mountain roads might still be looking for their next victim. I found this on a Reddit thread by user Deep Woods Hiker. The thing about being lost in the wilderness is that your mind starts playing tricks on you before your body starts shutting down. I learned this the hard way during what was supposed to be a simple day hike in Olympic National Park. What I experienced out there still makes me question whether I can trust my own judgment in dangerous situations. I consider myself an experienced hiker. I've been doing solo trips for over a decade, always prepared, always careful about letting people know my planned route. This particular trip was meant to be routine, a well-marked trail to a small alpine lake, maybe 6 hours round trip. Perfect for a Saturday in early October when the crowds would be gone, but the weather was still decent. The trail started normally enough. Clear markings, well-maintained path, beautiful fall colors just starting to show in the higher elevations. I'd hiked this same route 2 years earlier with friends, so I thought I knew what to expect. The first few miles went exactly as planned. It was around the 3-mile mark where I started noticing things felt different from what I remembered. The trails seemed narrower, more overgrown. The vegetation looked denser, and I couldn't recall passing through such thick forest canopy the last time. But trail conditions change, especially after storms, so I didn't think much of it initially. By mile 4, I should have been seeing signs pointing toward the lake turnoff. Instead, the path just kept winding upward through increasingly rough terrain. I stopped to check my map and GPS, but I was in one of those dead zones where satellite coverage gets spotty. My phone showed my location as a vague approximation somewhere in the general area, but not precise enough to pinpoint exactly where I'd gone wrong. I decided to backtrack to the last trail marker I remembered seeing clearly. That's when I made my first real mistake. I couldn't find it. Walking back down the path I'd just climbed, everything looked unfamiliar. Trees I thought I'd noticed on the way up weren't where I expected them to be. Rock formations seemed different. It was like I'd somehow taken a wrong turn without realizing it. After an hour of increasingly frantic retracing, I had to accept that I was genuinely lost. The smart thing would have been to stay put, conserve energy, and wait for my GPS to pick up a better signal. Instead, I kept moving, convincing myself that if I just kept going upward, I'd eventually hit a ridge where I could get my bearings. By mid-afternoon, the weather started changing. What had been a clear, crisp morning was turning into something more ominous. Clouds were building rapidly, and the temperature was dropping faster than it should have for that time of day. I realized I might be facing a night in the woods without proper gear for cold weather camping. That's when I started hearing the sounds. It began as rustling in the underbrush that seemed to move parallel to my direction of travel. At first, I assumed it was wildlife, maybe a deer or elk staying just out of sight. But the sounds had a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, too consistent with my own movements. When I stopped, the rustling stopped. When I moved, it resumed. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia brought on by stress and fatigue. Lost hikers often report feeling like they're being followed. It's a common psychological response to being alone and vulnerable in an unfamiliar environment. But the logical part of my brain was fighting with a growing sense that something was very wrong about my situation. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds got closer. I started catching glimpses of movement through the trees, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Dark shapes that could have been shadows, could have been animals, could have been something else entirely. My heart rate was elevated, not just from exertion now, but from genuine fear. Then I found the camp. Hidden in a grove of thick pine trees, maybe 50 yards off what I thought was still the trail, was a small clearing with obvious signs of human habitation. Not a designated camping area, but something more permanent and carefully concealed. There was a lean-to shelter built from branches and tarp, a fire ring surrounded by stumps arranged as seats, and most disturbingly of all, personal items that clearly belonged to other hikers. Backpacks, water bottles, hiking boots, pieces of clothing, all arranged in a way that suggested they'd been collected over time. Some of the items looked weathered, like they'd been there for months or even longer. Others appeared relatively new. I found a driver's license among the scattered belongings. The photo showed a young woman with short brown hair smiling at the camera. The license had expired 8 months ago. That's when I realized the sounds I'd been hearing weren't wildlife. I backed away from the camp as quietly as possible, but I could hear movement in the woods around me now that definitely was human. Footsteps on fallen leaves, the snap of branches, voices too distant to understand, but unmistakably real. Multiple voices, coordinating with each other. I ran. Not smart in unknown terrain, but I was beyond making smart decisions at that point. I crashed through undergrowth, scrambled over fallen logs, pushed through areas so thick I could barely squeeze between the trees. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Definitely more than one person, definitely getting closer. The woods seemed to go on forever. Every direction looked the same. Every path I followed seemed to lead deeper into trackless forest. My legs were burning, my lungs were screaming, and I knew I couldn't maintain this pace much longer. That's when I saw the road. It was barely more than a dirt track, overgrown and obviously unused for vehicle traffic, but it was clearly man-made. I followed it desperately, hoping it would lead to civilization or at least a main trail. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world: highway traffic. The dirt track emerged onto a paved road I didn't recognize, but there was a highway department marker that told me I was about 12 miles from the nearest town. A logging truck stopped when I flagged it down, and the driver said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. He was probably right. The police took my report seriously, especially when I mentioned the camp and the personal belongings. A search and rescue team went in the next day, but they never found the location I described. They said the coordinates I gave them led to an area that had been thoroughly searched during previous missing person investigations, and there was no evidence of any permanent camp. 3 people have gone missing on trails in that area over the past 2 years, all experienced hikers, all on solo trips, all last seen heading toward the same general region where I got lost. I think about that driver's license I found, and I wonder if whoever was collecting those belongings is still out there, still hunting for lost hikers who wander too far off the marked trails.
Someone DM'd me this on Twitter. The worst part about what happened to me at that gas station wasn't the immediate danger. It was realizing how close I came to disappearing without anyone knowing what had happened to me. Even now, 3 years later, I can't stop at unfamiliar gas stations without feeling that same creeping anxiety. I was driving cross country, moving from college in California back to my parents' house in Ohio. It was one of those impulsive decisions you make when you're 22 and think you can handle anything. I'd loaded everything I owned into my beat-up Toyota and decided to make the drive in 2 days, stopping overnight somewhere in Colorado. The first day went smoothly. I made good time through Nevada and most of Utah, stopping only for gas and quick food breaks. As evening approached, I was getting tired but wanted to push through to Denver before finding a hotel. That's where I made my first mistake. I should have stopped in a bigger city instead of trying to save a few hours. By the time I really needed gas, I was on a stretch of highway in eastern Colorado where towns were few and far between. It was one of those desolate areas where you might go 50 miles without seeing anything but wheat fields and the occasional ranch house. When I saw the gas station sign, my tank was running dangerously low, so I didn't have much choice but to stop. The place looked like it had been built in the 70s and hadn't been updated since. 2 pumps under a flickering fluorescent light, a small convenience store with windows so dirty you could barely see inside, and absolutely no other customers. My car was the only vehicle there, except for a beat-up pickup truck parked beside the building. I pulled up to the pump and tried to pay with my credit card, but the reader was broken. A handwritten sign taped to the pump said, "Pay inside first." I looked around the empty lot, feeling uneasy about the isolation, but I needed gas, and there weren't any other options for miles. The bell above the door made a harsh, jangling sound when I entered. The interior was dimly lit and smelled like stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't identify, something sweet and unpleasant. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, thin and wiry, with greasy hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me. He told me I needed $40 worth of gas on pump 2. He nodded slowly, taking his time to process the transaction, his fingers moving deliberately over the old cash register. While I waited, I noticed details about the store that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The security cameras were obviously fake, just empty plastic housings. The windows were covered with so many posters and advertisements that it was impossible to see outside clearly. And there was only one way in or out. "You traveling alone?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone that made me wish I'd lied. "I'm meeting friends in Denver," I said quickly, though it wasn't true. I don't know why I felt the need to make up a story, but something about his demeanor set off every alarm bell in my head. He smiled, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Long drive for a young lady by herself. Dangerous roads out here at night." I paid quickly and headed for the door, but his voice stopped me. "Bathroom's out of order if you need it. Got a clean one in the back room, though, through that door behind the counter." I assured him I was fine and pushed through the front door, but it stuck halfway open. While I struggled with it, I heard him talking to someone, though I hadn't seen anyone else in the store. Low voices, too quiet to understand the words, but definitely a conversation. Outside, I fumbled with the gas pump, my hands shaking as I tried to get it started. The pump was old and temperamental, clicking and whirring, but not dispensing fuel. I had to go back inside. The man was no longer behind the counter. I called out hello, but got no response. The store felt different somehow, quieter, more oppressive. That's when I noticed the door behind the counter was slightly open, and I could hear voices coming from whatever room was back there. I waited maybe 2 minutes, growing more anxious by the second. Finally, the man reappeared, but now there was someone with him. Another man, younger, wearing dirty coveralls and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Both of them looked at me with expressions I didn't like. "The pump's not working," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, that one's been acting up. You'll have to use the other pump." But when I looked through the window, I could see that my car was blocking the other pump, and there wasn't enough room to move it without backing up significantly. The younger man spoke for the first time. "We can move your car for you. got the keys? Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to hand over my keys, but I was trapped in a situation where being polite seemed safer than being confrontational. I told them I could move the car myself, but the older man insisted it would be easier if they did it since they knew how to angle it properly for the working pump. Against my better judgment, I handed over my keys. That's when I realized I'd made a potentially fatal mistake. The younger man went outside with my keys while the older one stayed in the store, positioning himself between me and the door. Through the dirty windows, I watched the younger man get into my car, but instead of just moving it to the other pump, he drove it around behind the building where I couldn't see it. "Where's he taking my car?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "Just parking it somewhere safe while we get you fueled up." But his demeanor had changed completely. He was no longer the slow, methodical clerk. There was an alertness about him now, a predatory focus that made my skin crawl. I told him I had changed my mind about the gas, that I needed to leave immediately. He smiled that yellow teeth smile again and shook his head. "Can't do that, honey. Your car's got a problem now. Gonna need some work before it's safe to drive." That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. I started backing toward the door, but he moved faster than I expected for someone his age. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled me away from the exit. "Let's just wait for my partner to come back and we'll get this all sorted out for you." I yanked my arm free and made a break for the door, but it was still stuck. I threw my full weight against it, and it finally gave way, sending me stumbling into the parking lot. I could hear him behind me, moving surprisingly quickly for someone who'd seemed so lethargic. I ran toward the road, hoping to flag down a passing car, but the highway was completely empty. Behind me, I could hear both men now, their voices coordinated, like they'd done this before. I kept running along the shoulder of the road, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I saw headlights in the distance, I ran into the middle of the highway, waving my arms frantically. The vehicle, a big rig, began slowing down long before it reached me. The truck driver was a middle-aged woman who took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. She let me into the cab and immediately called 911 on her CB radio. While we waited for police, she drove me back toward the gas station so I could show them where I'd left my car. The place was completely dark, no lights, no signs of activity, and my car was gone. It was like the whole incident had never happened, except for the fact that I was stranded on a highway in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and my wallet. The police found my car 2 days later, abandoned in a field about 30 miles away. Everything valuable had been stripped out of it, but more disturbing were the things they'd added: rope, duct tape, plastic sheeting, and a shovel in the trunk. The officer who interviewed me said they'd been investigating disappearances along that stretch of highway for over a year, all involving lone travelers who'd stopped for gas. I never found out what happened to the two men or whether they were ever caught. The gas station was closed when police went back the next day, and according to county records, it had been abandoned for months. No one could explain how it had been operating or who the men were who tried to trap me there. I finished my drive to Ohio in a rental car, and I've never driven alone on remote highways since then. Because somewhere out there are people who prey on travelers who make the same mistake I did, trusting that a public business in broad daylight would be a safe place to stop. The scariest part is how normal it all seemed at first. How easily I could have ended up as just another missing person case that never gets solved.